I'm 72, and I've learned that secrets don't rot away. They age, they thicken, and they learn your name. I've carried one since the winter of 1984, when the world was all snow and silence, and the baby inside me kicked like a question I couldn't answer. I lived alone then, miles from the nearest plowed road, in a cabin my husband built before he died, with walls that breathed pine and a stove that argued with the cold. That year the storms came early, pressing their mouths to the windows, and I counted my days by how much wood I had left and how long I could keep my hands from shaking. I was 7 months pregnant, careful with my steps, careless with my hope. Every morning I split kindling and boiled water that tasted of iron, and every night I listened to the forest rearrange itself. Trees cracked like bones. Wind stitched the dark shut. I told the baby stories out loud because silence can turn on you, because a voice keeps the cold from thinking it's won. I told myself I'd last the winter, that help would come in spring, that grief was a weather pattern and not a permanent climate. I believed that until the night the knock came. It wasn't the thud of a branch or the scamper of a raccoon. It was measured, patient, as if whoever stood outside knew the weight of a door and the courtesy of asking. I froze with a kettle in my hands, steam ghosting my face, heart tapping the ribs that already belonged to someone else. The dog, old and half-deaf, lifted his head and did not bark. That frightened me more than the sound. I set the kettle down, wrapped my coat around my belly, and took the shotgun from its nails, feeling the familiar chill of metal steady my breath. When I opened the inner latch and leaned my shoulder into the door, the cold rushed me like a tide, sharp and alive. He stood there, taller than the frame, formatted with ice, shoulders bowed as if he'd been carrying the night on his back. Snow had crusted his lashes. His breath came out in ragged clouds. The smell was wet iron and forest rot and something human underneath, something that remembered fire. His eyes found mine and held, not bright with hunger, not dull with stupidity, but wide and searching, as if he'd been counting on me. I should have screamed. I should have slammed the door and prayed. Instead I noticed the tremor in his hands, the way his weight shifted like a man trying not to fall in front of a stranger. The dog whimpered and crawled toward him, tail low. A flake melted on my cheek and burned. I thought of the baby, of the small, relentless life inside me, and of the math of mercy that never adds up until it's too late. My fingers loosened on the gun. The door opened wider. He stepped once, and the floor answered with a groan. He collapsed just past the threshold, a mountain folding into itself. The sound was terrible, final. I knelt, the boards biting my knees, and felt heat under the fur, felt a pulse that was wrong, too fast, too thin. Blood slicked my palm where ice had bitten him open. Outside, the wind took offense and screamed. Inside, the stove ticked and argued. I dragged him inch by inch, crying without sound, until his shoulder caught the light of the hearth and turned the room unreal. I don't remember choosing. I remember my hands moving, remember the door swinging shut, remember thinking that winters make their own laws. As I stoked the fire and pressed rags to a wound I didn't know how to name, I felt the baby kick, a small insistence, and I understood that the world had already noticed me. When his eyes opened again, dark and lucid in the firelight, I knew the cabin would never be just mine, and that whatever had knocked had come to stay, or to take something I could not afford to lose. I sat back on my heels and listened for engines, for voices, for the civilized world to interrupt what I'd done, but there was only the storm leaning harder against the walls. The radio on the shelf hissed and died. My breath fogged the room. His chest lifted, stalled, lifted again. In that pause I felt the old life slip and a new one edge closer, dangerous and tender. If the forest had sent him, it was asking a price. If he'd chosen me, it was a test. I did not yet know which, only that dawn would demand an answer. I waited, afraid, and listening. The first few days after he collapsed in my cabin were stitched together by fear, instinct, and the slow surrender of disbelief. I didn't sleep, not truly. I drifted in and out in the rocking chair beside the hearth, the shotgun balanced across my lap like a final line in the snow. He lay curled on the floor under the quilt I'd made the winter my husband passed, limbs like twisted oak, ribs rising and falling with an uneven tempo. The fire cast him in flickering amber, sometimes beast, sometimes something far closer. I listened to every breath. Listened harder when it stopped. At first, I expected him to die. Creatures that size don't belong indoors, under human roofs and woman-made warmth. But he didn't. He lived. Not because of what I did, I'm sure of that. He lived because he chose to. Chose to hold on. He didn't try to run. Didn't lash out. Just laid there, blinking, watching the flame like it carried answers. When he could sit up, he did so carefully, wincing at a wound on his side that I hadn't seen before. Old, half-healed, and ragged like barbed wire had caught him. I didn't ask how it happened. I just boiled water, tore up what little linen I had, and cleaned it until he stopped flinching. There was intelligence behind those eyes. Not just awareness. Understanding. When I wiped the blood away, he looked at me like he recognized what kindness cost. It was hard to be afraid when someone, or something, is that quiet in their pain. I boarded the windows tighter after that. Not because of him, but because something in my gut said this wasn't just about us anymore. A story like this doesn't stay inside four walls. And deep down, I knew he hadn't found me by accident. Something had driven him here. Something worse. He never spoke. Not in words. But he made sounds, low hums, chest-deep vibrations, and a rhythm I came to associate with comfort. He never touched anything without watching me first. When I handed him food, he waited for me to take a bite before accepting his share. He'd crouch near the fire, hands flat on the ground, eyes flicking between me and the door. Sometimes I caught him watching my belly. Not curious, but reverent. There was a kind of rhythm we fell into, the way storms find valleys. I would chop wood, and he'd follow me, silently observing. I'd feed the dog, and he'd mimic it, clumsy at first, but precise. One night, I left the kettle whistling too long, and he took it off the stove with a rag the same way I did. That's when I knew. He was learning me. I started calling him Ash, not for the fire or his dark, tangled hair, but for the way he moved. Quiet, lingering, never quite gone. Ash didn't growl or grunt or stomp. He glided through my cabin with a grace that didn't match his size. And every time I looked into his face, I found less fear and more recognition. There were days I forgot to fear him. Days I feared the outside more. Helicopters cut across the sky in hard lines. I heard them before I saw them, low, thumping rotors slicing through snow clouds. The radio squawked with alerts, large animal sightings, search teams scouring the northern trails, warnings to keep indoors. Unconfirmed species presence, they called it. I knew what that meant. Something had been seen. Something that didn't belong. I started keeping Ash in the root cellar when the sky got too loud. He didn't resist. He'd climb down into the dark, crouch low, and cover himself with burlap sacks without a sound. One morning, a man came to my cabin, thick coat, state badge, too many questions. Said they were tracking an anomaly. Asked if I'd seen anything strange. Footprints, broken fences, noises in the night. I told him the snow had been too thick. I told him I was pregnant and alone and too tired for stories. He looked around, lingered on the fire, on the extra bowl by the hearth. But he left. Eventually. When I lifted the root cellar door that evening, Ash was already halfway up the ladder, eyes wide with waiting. I knew then that he understood danger. Not just pain or cold, but human danger. The kind that comes with searchlights and guns and papers full of words like containment. That night, he did something I'll never forget. I was sitting near the fire, hand resting over the baby, trying not to cry from the weight of it all. Ash crept forward, sat across from me, and slowly reached out his hand. Not to me, but to my belly. He didn't touch. Just hovered there, close enough that I could feel the heat from his palm. His breathing slowed. His eyes softened. It was the gentlest thing I'd ever seen. I didn't say a word. Didn't need to. In that stillness, in that silence where the world narrowed down to heartbeat and firelight, I realized something had shifted. This creature, this myth, was not my enemy. He was my witness. My protector. Maybe even my friend. But just as I began to believe we were safe in that stillness, the dog started barking at the window. A low, relentless growl I hadn't heard in weeks. Ash stood slowly, all instincts flaring to life. And from the corner of the cabin, I saw it, through the smallest crack in the boarded glass. Headlights. 2 of them. Crawling up the snowy trail like a slow, hungry question. Ash didn't move when the headlights crept closer. He stood in the shadows near the hearth, still as carved stone, his breath rising slow in the firelight. I stood too, one hand on my belly, the other gripping the shotgun, not out of anger, not even fear anymore, but protection. It wasn't him I was protecting myself from. It was them. The ones who came with clipboards and cold hands, and words like disposal and specimen. Outside, tires crunched fresh snow. The dog barked louder, then whimpered, as if even he knew this was something bigger than a knock on the door. They didn't come all the way to the porch. Whoever it was stopped short, their vehicle idling, engine ticking like a heartbeat too loud to ignore. Then the light turned off, swallowed by the woods, and the night went quiet again. But we both knew it was a warning. Someone had found the trail. Ash stared toward the door long after the engine faded. His shoulders squared like he was waiting for a storm to announce itself. The next morning, I found the tracks. Men's boots. 3 sets. They hadn't reached the cabin, but they'd gotten close enough to see smoke. I spent the day shoveling fresh snow over every footprint around the house, covering our story one step at a time. Ash watched from the tree line, part of the forest again, only his eyes visible through the frost-bitten firs. He didn't come in that night. Not until long after I'd locked the door and pretended to sleep. I heard his fingers brush the wood outside, a signal now, asking permission. I opened it. He moved differently after that. Less like a guest, more like something trying not to break anything it loved. He ducked his head through door frames, walked barefoot over creaking boards, folded his body tight to sit near the fire without taking up space. I don't know if he feared hurting me, or if he feared making me choose between him and safety. Maybe both. Maybe he already knew I'd chosen. Snow fell heavier the next week, as if the forest itself wanted to bury the evidence of what we were becoming. He learned my rhythms. How to boil water for tea, how to peel apples without wasting the skin. Once, I found him humming. Not a song, but something like one, a low, echoing rumble that vibrated the cabin walls and made the dog crawl into my lap. It was the sound of old mountains shifting, of something ancient trying to speak a language it had never been taught. And then the baby came. Too early. Too fast. I woke to pain that cut like a blade between my ribs. My water broke by the hearth, and the firelight looked too much like blood. I screamed. Not because of the pain, though it was more than I thought a body could bear, but because I was alone. I didn't know where Ash had gone. I thought he'd left. Fled into the woods the way myths do when the world presses too hard. But then he was there. In the doorway. Snow on his shoulders, steam rising from his back. He dropped something at his feet, branches, towels, something wrapped in fur, and moved to my side without hesitation. He knelt beside me, one hand on the floor, the other held out in quiet offering. And for hours, he didn't leave. He stoked the fire when it dimmed, brought water when I cried for it, grunted when I screamed, as if sharing the burden. When the baby came, slick and screaming, it was into his shadow. I cut the cord myself, sobbing, holding that small pink life against my chest while Ash sat back, his great hands shaking in his lap. He didn't come closer. Just watched, chest heaving, as if he'd witnessed the most fragile kind of magic. I named her Eliza, and when I whispered it into the firelight, I swear I saw his eyes close, like he was memorizing the sound. The next morning, I found him cradling her. I dozed off in the rocker, too exhausted to watch. But there he was, kneeling beside her cradle, fingers tracing the edge without touching. She gurgled, unafraid. Reached out. He let her grab one coarse strand of hair, and he didn't move, didn't flinch. Just watched her like she was the last piece of something he'd once had and lost. But peace doesn't last. Not here. Not when the world's watching. 2 days later, Eliza started coughing. Wet, rattling sounds that didn't belong in a newborn's chest. Her skin flushed red, then pale. I tried honey, herbs, steam, anything. But her breath turned shallow, and her cries became soft, like she was apologizing for needing more than I had. The nearest clinic was 9 miles away, too far by foot in a storm. But there was a ranger station halfway, 3 miles if the snow held. I bundled Eliza in every blanket I had and laid her in a basket. I turned to Ash. His brow furrowed deep. He knew. He stepped toward me, one hand raised like a plea, but I shook my head. "I'll be back," I whispered. "Stay here. Keep her warm." He didn't stop me. Just stood in the doorway as I left, the snow already starting to fall again. I walked with fire in my legs, pain blooming where I'd barely healed. I didn't feel the cold. I didn't feel anything but the space between each of her breaths. When I returned 3 hours later, the sky was dark and the trail half gone. My boots were soaked, my hands raw. I opened the cabin door with my heart in my throat. The fire was out. The cradle was empty. Ash was gone. And so was Eliza. I called for them until my voice cracked in the wind. I searched the cabin, tore through every drawer, every shadow, like I'd misplaced time itself. The fire was nothing but ash. The cradle was tipped gently on its side, not broken, just empty. The blankets were gone too. My legs gave out, and I knelt on the floor, sobbing in a way that didn't feel human. I wasn't a mother or a woman or even a person in that moment. I was a wound wide open. I didn't know if they'd been taken, or if Ash had run. I didn't know what choice he thought he'd made. But I knew I would die if I didn't find them. The snow was still falling, thick now, erasing footprints almost as fast as they were made. But I found a trail, bent branches, heavy impressions, the ghost of something large and careful moving through the trees. I wrapped my coat around my waist tight, took the rifle and a flask of broth, and followed it. No thoughts. Just motion. My limbs moved like they remembered something I didn't. Every step cut deeper into the snow. My stitches had torn again. I could feel it, warm and wet inside my boots. But I didn't stop. It was nearly dark when I saw the light. Faint, flickering, unnatural, an orange pulse behind a wall of trees. My hands trembled. I moved slow, careful. Each step forward peeled back fear and layered on something worse, hope. The kind that punishes you for having it. I found them in a hollow under an ancient pine, its limbs bent low with ice like it had been protecting them on purpose. Ash had built a shelter, branches stacked with thought, bark packed with snow for insulation, fire ringed in stones too evenly placed to be wild. And there, tucked against his chest, was Eliza. She was breathing. Slow, but steady. Her cheeks were pink. Not frostbitten. Not pale. Ash was slumped against the wall of the shelter, his arms wrapped around her like roots. His face was gray in the firelight, not the black-brown of fur but the waxy tone of something giving in. His breath rattled, shallow, not enough. I dropped to my knees beside him, stripped off my gloves, and touched his face. He blinked. I whispered his name, just once. He looked down at Eliza, then back at me. His lips parted, but no sound came. He was too far gone. He'd used everything he had to get her here, to keep her alive. And in that moment, I understood what he had done. He'd seen what I couldn't. Heard the engines before I could. Smelled the men on the wind. And he had taken her, not to run from me, but to save her from them. Because they would have seen her being cradled by something they feared, and they would have destroyed all of it. Her life is mine. So he ran. Into the woods. Into the storm. Not to escape, but to protect. I tried to give him broth. He wouldn't take it. I tried to warm his hands. They didn't move. He just stared at her, like he was memorizing her one last time. His fingers twitched, barely. I slipped Eliza from his arms and held her to my chest. She whimpered once and fell asleep against me. And Ash smiled. Not with teeth. Just with his eyes. I reached out, placed my hand on his chest, felt the thud slower, then nothing. Silence. Even the fire went quiet. I buried him the next morning, under the same tree where he'd made his final stand against the cold. I worked until my hands blistered, until the pain in my belly warned me I wouldn't have another chance. I didn't mark the grave with a cross. I didn't say a prayer. I just pressed my hand into the snow above him and whispered, "Thank you." Then I walked away, back into a world that could never know what kindness had passed through it. I made it to the ranger station that evening, Eliza swaddled tight against me. I told them I'd gotten lost, that I'd blacked out, that someone must have helped me. They asked questions. I lied. And when they asked what happened to the man in the woods, I said I never saw one. They didn't press. They never do when it's a woman who's already lost too much. The rest of that winter passed like a dream you wake up from only halfway. I returned to the cabin only once, to gather a few things, to board it shut. I never went back after that. I didn't want the forest to think I was greedy. I'd been given a life. I wouldn't ask for more. Eliza grew strong, stronger than I ever was. Sharp-eyed, curious, a quiet kind of wild in her bones. When she was 5, she asked why I always looked sad when it snowed. I told her snow remembers, that it holds prints even after we've stopped looking for them. She never knew who saved her. Not really. I never told her about the one who held her closer than most men hold their own blood. I never said his name aloud after that winter. But I see him in her sometimes. The way she watches storms. The way she listens before speaking. The way she moves like she belongs nowhere and everywhere at once. And sometimes, when the wind rises through the pine and the fire cracks just right, I hear it again. That low hum. That sound older than language, older than grief. A sound I thought had died with him. But maybe not. Because just last week, she came to me with her sketchpad. Said she saw something near the trees behind her school. Drew it from memory. Dark fur. Deep eyes. A hand, reaching out, not to scare. To say hello. And I didn't say a word. I just watched her draw. And I listened. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.